Okay, so welcome everybody to this event organised as part of the Cambridge Festival. It's my great pleasure today to be introducing my colleague, Dr. Henry Shevlin. But before I do that, two quick things to note. Firstly, closed captions will be available during the talk. You should be able to switch those on at the bottom of your screen now. Secondly, after the talk, we will have a few minutes for Q&A. But if a question occurs to you during the talk, there's no need to wait. You should feel free to submit that in the Q&A straight away, and we'll do our best at the end to get to as many questions as we can. So our speaker today, Dr. Henry Shevlin, is a Senior Research Fellow at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence, which is an interdisciplinary research centre where researchers from across the disciplines, including computer science, law, history, and philosophy, work together to explore the impact of AI and to make the best of its opportunities. Now, Henry is a philosopher of cognitive science whose work focuses on non-human minds, and his special interests include consciousness, creativity, and suffering. And he will also be part of the team at CFI leading the new master's program in AI ethics and society. So rather appropriately today, he's going to give us a talk called Suffer the Little Robots, the Moral and Legal Status of Artificial Beings. So Henry, take it away.
Thank you very much, Ali, and thanks for that great introduction. And thank you all, everyone today, for being here on Good Friday, for taking the time out of the holiday weekend to join us for this talk. So as Ali mentioned, my work so far has focused on non-human minds in the broad sense, both animals and AI, with particular interests in consciousness and suffering. And I've done quite a lot of work at this point on issues in animal welfare. And it was really only about 2 or 3 years ago that I started getting interested in this maybe more exotic question of whether we might one day think that about the welfare of artificial beings, robots or AIs, whether they deserve some kind of moral status. Now, this is an idea that I think is familiar to many of us from science fiction. You know, from Terminator to Humans on Channel 4, Anita the android from there, or Blade Runner movies, or Commander Data from Star Trek. The idea that robots might suffer or have some kind of moral status is one that's really familiar, and very often in the fiction that we see from the Frankenstein movie classic with Boris Karloff a long time ago. Another common theme has been the idea that humans might fail to recognize that these beings have moral status or deserve rights or proper consideration and treatment. And as we head forward into an age of smarter and better computers, I think this starts to look a little bit less like science fiction. And we might genuinely start to worry, well, what if we build systems that have moral rights and for whatever reason we fail to appropriately recognize them? And so that's going to be my theme today. So just a quick background on this idea of moral status. So this is a complex and vexed topic in philosophy, but the kind of core basic idea is that having moral status means you have the right to be taken into consideration, to have your interests considered in moral decision making. So those interests could be material interests, they could be emotional interests, but it's something that these days we extend pretty much without hesitation to all human beings. We consider human beings to be unequivocally things that we should be taken into consideration. That's obviously not always been the case. The history of racism has meant that different humans were given different moral status in different systems. But now, at least in philosophy, the idea that we all have this universal human entitlement to moral consideration, it goes without question. Another area historically, of course, where this hasn't always been true besides racism is, of course, in our treatment of children. If you look back at the way the Victorians even treated their children, or let alone thinking of sort of the Spartan, probably apocryphal practices of exposing children on the hills, again, it's not clear that young children were always given full moral consideration. But again, these days, that's not so controversial. What is more controversial, and has been for a long time, is the moral status of non-humans. Basically, for most of the debate, that's focused on animals, of course. Philosopher Immanuel Kant has got a bit of a dodgy reputation these days, precisely because he was very skeptical of the idea that we had any kind of moral obligations towards animals. In short, and crudely summarizing his views, Kant thought that moral obligations that we had towards other humans arose because other humans had a capacity to reason or be moved by reasons, whether in forming our beliefs or choosing actions. And it's this universal possession of reason that grounds our moral obligations towards them. That's not to say that Kant thought we could do anything we liked with animals. He's got one famous passage where he talks about how someone who mistreats a dog might get into the habit of mistreating other humans. Just if they got too used to being cruel to animals. But he certainly didn't think animals had any intrinsic moral status that we needed to respect. That sort of view is no longer the dominant approach to non-human moral status. These days, in particular, the idea that suffering is what grounds moral status has become very prominent. This is a view that I think was eloquently and influentially put by the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham way back in the 18th century, who, in speaking about the moral states of animals, said, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And this idea that suffering is what grounds moral status has been very influential, particularly on utilitarian philosophers, and the work of people like Peter Singer, who some of you may have come across, whose landmark book, Animal Liberation, in the 1970s, played a big role in the modern animal rights movement. This idea that suffering is what matters for moral status has also been reflected in legal protections for animals in lots of different jurisdictions. As I'll mention later on in the talk briefly, legal protections for animals vary dramatically around the world. But Britain has been one of the pioneers in this regard. And interestingly, in 1993, an amendment was made to the Scientific Procedures Act from the 1980s, specifically to add octopuses as having special protections under the law. And you can sort of read the considerations that motivated this. And again, it was basically this idea that octopuses are relatively plausible candidates for being able to feel pain and undergo forms of suffering. So let's say we work with this idea that suffering is what's key to moral status. But what is suffering? Well, again, this is controversial and widely discussed by scientists and philosophers. But the basic idea is that suffering involves states that feel bad. Now, pain is the obvious case here. Pains feel bad. But pain isn't the only kind of state that can feel bad. Things like nausea, extremes of hunger or thirst, dyspnea, to use a technical term, inability to breathe. If you've ever been trapped underwater even for a few seconds, that feeling of being unable to breathe can be horrible. And of course, a whole raft of negative emotions, sadness, anxiety, grief, despair. All of these states have this immediate quality of feeling bad, of being unpleasant to go through. Now, I should maybe mention here, actually, part of what motivated my interest in suffering is reflected quite evocatively in this picture here. About 3 or 4 years ago, I found myself with a nasty bout of food poisoning, and I was curled up next to the toilet for 3 days, dry heaving, in a state of considerable discomfort. And I sort of found myself amidst all this unpleasantness, having a philosophical reflection, thinking, God, I feel so awful, I feel terrible, but I'm not in pain. How interesting. And that's partly what motivated my interest in suffering in general, and this phenomenon that lots of different states can feel bad to us. Now, obviously, suffering plays a purpose, plays a role for us. Different states feel bad, generally because they're states that, for various evolutionary or social reasons, it's not good for us to be in. So suffering can be useful. People with congenital insensitivity to pain, for example, who are unable to feel pain, have really difficult lives and often undergo different kinds of bodily injuries precisely because they can't tell whether or not they're in pain or whether or not they're undergoing bodily damage. So suffering can be useful. Suffering can also, in a funny way, be indirectly pleasurable. I'm thinking here of, I'm sure some of you have experienced sort of the strange pleasure that comes from a painful run on a hot day, or the feeling of soreness in your muscles after a tough workout, or even more sort of masochistic pleasures, like the pleasure of eating very, very spicy food. So again, unpleasantness can, in the grand scheme of things, even be pleasurable. But I think it's fair to say that other things being equal, when you control for all the usefulness that suffering can play, or the occasions in which it can be pleasurable, suffering, other things being equal, makes you worse off, and grounds at least a prima facie moral obligation. When we see someone suffering and it's not in their interests and we can do something about it, you might think, we have some kind of obligation to alleviate or prevent that kind of suffering. And that cuts across species and may ultimately even extend to AI. So let's think about now this question of why on earth you might think that AIs could suffer and hence deserve some moral status on that basis. I think there are several reasons for taking this seriously. The first, as I mentioned in my talk yesterday in some more detail, is that we are in the middle of an AI explosion. Very few people could have predicted even 10 years ago that we'd be as far along as we are now. And we're making rapid progress across multiple domains of AI. And of course, whilst it's tricky to make exact comparisons between AI and animals, in at least some measures of computational complexity, for example, the number of synapses in AIs compared to the number of parameters in our large AI models, AIs are actually already approaching the degree of computational complexity, in this one sense anyway, that we see in some animals. So for example, some modern AIs have a number of parameters roughly equivalent to the number of synapses in a honeybee brain. So with this rapid progress, including in some domains that are traditionally very hard for AI, I think it's no longer crazy to think we are on the verge of being able to build something like systems with the complexity of biological brains. Also, many of the ways in which we've made advances in AI in the last 10 years bring us closer to the kinds of cognition and computation seen in biological brains. This is, again, a really complex debate that I'm not going to go into in a lot of detail here. But certainly a lot of the tasks that were traditionally seen as very hard for AI, things like understanding natural scenes or operating with limited information in complex environments, or even understanding social intentions. These are precisely the areas in which we've made a lot of progress. We're also a long way from the AIs that had to be programmed almost from scratch. Think about sort of the chess-playing computers of the 1980s that operated according to strict logical rules. As I'm sure many of you are aware, that's really just not what modern AI looks like. Modern AI is trained very often on large amounts of natural real-world data, very often through processes of things like reinforcement learning that actually do in some important ways resemble the kind of processes by which biological brains learn about their environment. So all of this makes the difference between biological brains and artificial intelligence look a lot less salient, a lot less obvious. And again, it's worth emphasizing that suffering comes in many forms. As I was emphasizing earlier on, one of the strange things about suffering is it's not tied to one particular kind of sensation or emotion. This felt badness can manifest itself in so many different domains. So it's not obvious to me that AIs couldn't have their own forms of felt unpleasantness and couldn't suffer in ways, even if those ways are quite different from some of the ways that we associate with humans and animals. Now, of course, there are lots of negative arguments here. Lots of reasons you might give for thinking that AIs could never suffer or never have the same kinds of negative experiences that humans and animals undergo. I'm not going to have time to go through all of them, although hopefully maybe some will come up in questions. But I think probably a lot of these boil down to this question of consciousness. Suffering presupposes consciousness, or sometimes what's called sentience, the ability to have experiences that have this good or bad feeling, this valence as it's sometimes called. Now, unless AIs could be conscious, this argument goes, they couldn't meaningfully suffer. If AIs don't have experiences, if there's nothing it's like to be an AI, then whatever negative or positive states they're undergoing are, strictly speaking, morally irrelevant. AIs would just be artifacts like any other. And it would be as crazy to think about an AI suffering as it would be to worry that your hammer suffers when you use it to hit a nail. Here, though, I think it's important to keep track of changing views about consciousness in cognitive science. Whereas, again, as recently as 20 years ago, there were plenty of people who still thought that consciousness might even be a uniquely human phenomenon. That's changed rapidly. There are still advocates for human exceptionalism who think that consciousness is in some way uniquely human. But it's becoming increasingly common to speculate about consciousness that's widespread in the animal kingdom. Some of you may have come across books like Peter Godfrey Smith's book Other Minds, talking about octopus sentience, octopus consciousness. And there's also been a lot of work in recent years driven by behavioral ecology and work in comparative psychology on insect cognition that's led people like Colin Klein and others to suggest that maybe bees and other insects could have some form of consciousness, some form of sentience. And as I mentioned earlier on, according to at least some measures of complexity, the AI systems we're building have a complexity approaching that of bee brains. Obviously, they still work according to very different principles, but they're catching up in at least that domain. And if insects can be conscious, is it so crazy to think that some of the AIs we might be building over the next decade or two could also exhibit consciousness and sentience and thereby be equipped to suffer? So this is where I think it's clear that we need, as a species, a better science of suffering. We can't just look at AIs or animals and read off suffering in most cases. our feelings of empathy or compassion towards animals are notoriously fallible and biased. This is something that comes up in animal welfare communities, where of course it's easy to get funding for pandas and whales and other charismatic megafauna, as they're sometimes called. But it's much harder to get funding to alleviate suffering, perhaps, in creatures like fish. We are biased. We like creatures that are big and fluffy and look like us, and whose behavior is naturally intelligible to us. Now here there's a real problem for AIs. AIs by their very nature are very different from us. And even if we can detect or read off or intuit suffering in something like a dog or a cat, it's far harder to know that we'll be able to identify suffering in artificial systems. What does a suffering AI look like? There's no reason to assume it'll be able to tell us, right? Any more than a honeybee can tell us that it might be undergoing pain. And likewise, we shouldn't assume that the AIs, the first AIs that might be capable of undergoing suffering, are going to look like Commander Data, being able to talk about their experiences eloquently. The first suffering system may look more like some giant mainframe or database like this, that thanks to its cognitive complexity and use of reinforcement learning and positive and negative feedback mechanisms, might actually have some states that feel bad in light of its overall cognitive complexity and cognitive sophistication. Here again, I should emphasize that our species does have a bad track record. We've very frequently overlooked suffering in animals, in children, and other humans. And so here I think there's a compelling argument that we should try and get ahead of the technology before we start to build systems with the kind of complexity that make them serious candidates for consciousness and perhaps also suffering. It would be great if we could get a better handle on what suffering is, how it works in the human brain and the brains of animals, and how it might work in other systems. This is especially true given one possibility that may seem far-fetched, again, even more far-fetched than AI suffering, but I think it's just worth briefly processing. Humans and other animals exhibit a certain kind of ability to adapt to pain and other unpleasant states. This is sometimes called hedonic adaptation. In short, there are very good evolutionary reasons why even if you're in severe pain or in severe nausea, you're usually able, in most cases, though not all, to adapt to it in at least some ways to enable you to fix the problem, whether that's getting an injured limb out of danger or finding food if you're desperately hungry. It's not in our evolutionary interest to be paralyzed by suffering or to experience extremes of suffering. But once you're dealing with artificial systems that haven't been subjected to the rigors of natural selection, those safeguards may not apply. We might unwittingly subject AI systems to extremes of suffering that far outrank or are far more severe than those that we experience as humans or than those that animals are capable of. Again, this is an even more extreme possibility than AI suffering, but I think it's one that's serious enough that it should be on our radar. So one common objection I hear raised when you even start talking about AI suffering is that, look, we do horrific things to other humans and animals. Shouldn't living beings be our priority here? And I'm not sure that's necessarily true, but I'm happy to grant that, look, perhaps, when speculating about the mere possibility of AI suffering, of course, humans and animals should be our practical priority, insofar as we already know that humans are suffering and that animals are suffering. But again, here, in urging a better science of suffering, I think this can also help us treat animals better. There are big debates at the moment, for example, about whether fish can feel pain, whether octopuses can feel pain. And by developing a better cognitive science of suffering, by better understanding how suffering works, we might ultimately be able to answer those questions in informative ways. If fish don't feel pain, and we have good reason to believe that, then that might allow us to better channel our resources in certain directions. Another reason I think it's important to have a science of suffering here, and to be realistic, is that it may just tell us that we don't need to worry about AIs, at least for the time being. We don't need to worry about certain AIs. And I do think there's a positive risk here of overestimating the extent to which AIs may have moral status. Some of you may recognize this picture of Sophia the robot, who was given citizenship of Saudi Arabia now a few years ago. Now this was a PR stunt, really. Sophia is not smart. She's not a cutting-edge AI in any sense, but she can do a passable job of impersonating a human being. And for that reason, there's a certain kind of natural empathy that we might want to extend to her. And there's a huge amount of interest in things like social robotics towards building more and more lifelike AIs, or systems that can interact with us in more lifelike ways. Some of you may have seen ads for AI therapists or chatbots like Replica that promise you an AI friend or even an AI romantic partner. And this is obviously a huge area of commercial interest at the moment. I don't think it would be that surprising if 10 years from now, people were forming deep and profound, or at least subjectively profound relationships with AIs that weren't really based on any cognitive complexity on the AI's part, but rather their ability to convincingly masquerade as a sentient being. In that case, I think there's a risk that people, well-minded people, well-intentioned people, might clamor for rights for their AI friends or AI boyfriends or girlfriends, when actually you're still dealing with systems that have nothing like the degree of complexity or cognitive sophistication required for those descriptions to be well warranted. And if we did plow resources into protecting these AIs that didn't deserve protection, didn't need protection, then there's a risk that we would channel those resources away from things like animal welfare or human welfare, where they could be better used. So in moving towards a science of suffering, the goal is not just to include every possible being that might want to be protected, that we might want to protect, but to have some kind of grounded scientific basis for thinking about which systems deserve our protection, which systems are capable of really undergoing suffering. So I've talked a lot about prospects for a science of suffering. It's something I've done some work on, and there's a lot of good work being done on. But I think it's fairly clear that we're still a long way from understanding how reward mechanisms in the brain work and how that translates into something like positive and negative experience or suffering. So I think it's also worth thinking about heuristics or simple tools we could use in the meantime to help make some fallible, temporary, but still practical solutions for thinking about AI suffering. And one proposal I've defended in print is that we might expand existing animal rights law to cover possible future AIs that have relevantly similar cognitive capacities. The idea here is not that, just because a robot looks like a dog and can wag its robo tail, it deserves protection under the law, but rather that any AIs, future AIs, that genuinely are as cognitively sophisticated as animals to which we already assign protections should also benefit from those protections in law. So if we can build AIs with the behavioral sophistication and cognitive complexity of dogs or cats, say, that have things like episodic memory perhaps, or have complex reward systems, or are able to engage in social cognition, those AIs should benefit from the protections that already exist for animals with similar capabilities. Now, of course, there are lots of problems with this approach. It's definitely not meant to be a universal solution. It's a temporary heuristic, as I say. I mean, one problem, of course, is that our animal rights law is a mess. Internationally, in particular, there's very little consensus on which animals deserve protection and which animals can suffer. That's something that I hope will be ameliorated in light of a science of suffering as this project gets going. But I also think that that as this project advances, these advances can also be integrated into our protections for future AIs. Once we start thinking about the kind of capacities that might be useful measures of a capacity to experience suffering or might be associated with moral status, we won't need to ask, oh, but does this also apply to AIs? By defining our protections in these neutral cognitive terms, in terms of what the animals can do, these will automatically carry over into protections for AIs. Now, in case any of you are thinking this sounds deranged, let me stress that no current AIs are going to qualify under these measures. There's simply not the kind of general intelligence present in current AIs to warrant these protections applying to them. So, you don't need to worry about your iPhone being granted time off at this point. As I said in my talk yesterday, the real striking difference between animals and AIs in their current form is general intelligence. By general intelligence, I mean roughly a capacity to operate robustly, flexibly, and autonomously. Animals can do all sorts of complex things, manage complex environments, integrate signals from multiple different sense organs, manage multiple different needs, from eating, shelter, maintaining body temperature, to mating. And no AI currently comes close to this, although I do think we are closing the gap. AIs are lacking in these regards. There are still stark differences. But given the sheer amount of interest already in developing AIs that come closer to the cognitive capabilities of animals, I don't think it's particularly far-fetched to think that a decade or two hence, we might well have AIs with these capacities that would concurrently warrant some form of ethical consideration or even legal protection. Okay, so to wrap up the talk, today I've argued that it's not too soon to start thinking about whether future AIs might deserve some moral status, some moral consideration. And there's no reason to assume that it's simply impossible for AIs to suffer or have some kind of moral capacities in light of the breakneck progress in AI. The cognitive equivalence strategy that I just described, I think, suggests a useful heuristic or way forward. But ultimately, as a species, we need a better science of suffering, and that is what will ultimately allow us to answer the questions about the kinds of systems and beings that deserve moral consideration. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Henry, for that really interesting talk. We have a few minutes now for Q&A. I can see we've got a few questions already, but if you have a question and you want to drop it in the Q&A now, go ahead. So why don't we start with a question from Agustin, who asks, do you think that the very idea that artificial systems would develop in an anthropomorphic way stems from our human-centric worldview? So for instance, why would developing a specific human-like way of problem solving mean becoming sentient?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's going to boil down to really what your views about consciousness are. I will say that consciousness, I think most people would assume plays some kind of function. Among the leading theories of consciousness at the moment are theories like global workspace theory or integrated information theory that both see consciousness as naturally arising from certain kinds of cognitive architectures. Broadly speaking, those that involve some kind of centralized place where information is brought together from different systems, or systems that have a high degree of informational integration across different areas. Now, I don't think there's any reason to assume that AIs have to exhibit these capacities, but to the extent that things like information integration is useful for problem solving, or having a central executive control area is useful for problem solving, I think it's likely that we will inevitably, well, maybe that's too strong, but I think it's very likely that we will naturally want to build systems with these capacities that will be consequently conscious. And that's not even to mention the fact that there are people already around the world specifically trying to build conscious AIs. And I think if we're thinking about the possibility of robotic friends or partners, building robots or AIs able to really feel emotions is a key goal for these projects. You can just imagine it as a great selling point for an AI companion bot. Oh, this AI has real compassion. AI can feel sad at your suffering. So I think it's both a likely natural tendency that we'll see consciousness emerging in AI systems, but also I think it's likely to be a specific goal of several ongoing research programs.
Great, thanks, Henry. So here's another really interesting question from Murray, who is a retired psychologist and psychotherapist. That's the perspective he's coming from. When he asks, are we likely to be looking in 20 or 30 years at needing to give psychotherapy as an intervention for robots who develop multiple personalities?
I think that's a fantastic question, and also the basis of an excellent sci-fi short story.
Yes.
So, I mean, the one thing I would say is that I think the human brain is very oddly constructed. It's not clear to me that if you were trying to optimize for intelligence, you'd start out with an architecture like that of the human brain. Some of you may be familiar with the triune brain model, which I think it's outdated, but it's still a useful way of thinking about things. The idea that we have a mammalian brain bolted onto a reptilian brain with the neocortex rising over the top. Now, as I should stress, this is not sort of the current way of thinking about the evolution of the brain, but I think it does bring out the fact that we have this whole bunch of different cognitive capacities acquired over evolutionary timescales. And I think a lot of our problems, as it were, our psychological problems, arise from these kinds of overlapping evolutionary endowments. Things like weakness of will or addiction or other phenomena you might think arise from this. So my hope would be that in designing intelligent AIs from scratch, we could do a better job than evolution has done on us. That may sound bold or even hubristic, but for that reason, they might not need all the detailed psychotherapy that we need, or at the very least, they need a different kind of psychotherapy. At least that would be my hope.
Great. So now we have a question from Alex, who asks, if we assume that AIs do have the capacity for suffering and that suffering occurs as part of their programmed activity, then we might not be able to avoid the suffering without also stopping using them in that way. So is it then a moral obligation for us to stop creating AIs in the same way that you might think it's an obligation not to bring children into the world if you believe they will suffer?
Oh, such a good question. And this cuts to a bunch of very thorny philosophical problems that are often grouped together under the label population ethics. So this kind of question also comes up in relation to animals. So I think one of the best arguments, I mean, I'm a vegetarian, I've been a vegetarian for most of my life, but I think one of the best arguments for the possibility of ethical meat eating would be that, look, if humans stopped eating meat, then animals just simply wouldn't exist in the numbers to which they do at the moment. And if we were to farm animals ethically, I mean, to the extent that we already do in some cases, these animals have lives that are on balance still worth living, even if they involve some extremes of suffering in certain contexts. I think that's actually a reasonable argument worth taking into consideration when thinking about the ethical permissibility of eating meat, for example. So to the extent that suffering was inevitable for AIs, I think I'd be inclined to say that our obligations would be, that wouldn't prevent us from creating them necessarily, as long as we did our best to minimize suffering and ensured that these AIs had, on balance, lives worth living. One, again, very slightly crazy sci-fi possibility I've heard considered is the idea of pleasure offsets. So let's say you have an AI that has to do some kind of, sort of like climate offsets. Let's say you have an AI that has to do some task that requires inevitably it undergoing suffering. Well, maybe you could compensate for that by giving it some supercharged pleasure states at other times, thereby balancing out the suffering. So I mean, these are the kind of questions that hopefully will keep philosophers employed for a long time as we deal with conscious AI and the possibilities of pleasure and pain in these systems.
Excellent, thanks, Henry. So now we have another question from Michael. Would you expect in the science of suffering to see a physical correlate of suffering in the brains of humans, of animals, and in AI?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question again. So some kind of physical correlate, yes, but it might be quite an abstract physical correlate. We know that suffering, like I said, we know that suffering isn't something as simple as pain. It's something that can be attached to a wide variety of different states, some of them bodily, others of them more emotional, and you might even think that we have sort of intellectual pains. Think about Weltschmerz or existential angst. So to the extent that suffering can accompany a wide range of different states, it's unlikely to have one simple correlate. That said, there's been some speculation about the role of the anterior cingulate gyrus in unpleasant states in humans. This created a little bit of a kerfuffle a few years ago on academic Twitter that goes with the wonderful name of Cingulate Gate, where people were arguing about whether activations in the cingulate gyrus could be interpreted as meaning unpleasantness, as indicating unpleasantness. There were papers with titles like social exclusion really hurts, on the basis of the fact that forms of social exclusion did involve activations in these regions. So it's a complex story. I don't think suffering is something transcendent. I think it's likely to have some basis in the brain, but probably quite an abstract one, and probably not as simple as activations in this region in every case.
Excellent. Okay, so we are nearly coming to the end of our time now, but I'm just going to take one last question, this time from Adam, who raises a couple of related possibilities. So firstly, what do you think of the idea that robots and AI could become an outlet for humanity's worst impulses? So could we end up using them as a means of delivering therapy for sadistic tendencies? And maybe relatedly, if AIs were capable of offering humans compassion, is that something that could become addictive?
Oh, it's a great question. Yeah, so going back to the Kant's case of the dog, Kant's dog, where he worries that someone who treats dogs inhumanely would be acquiring negative impulses or vices of character that would lead them to treat humans badly. I think this is already something to be concerned about. And I guess I regard it as sort of an open empirical question. To what extent would, for example, shooting AIs in some kind of sophisticated immersive virtual reality video game, these AIs did have cognitive complexity, would that be a form of catharsis, allowing people to discharge their violent impulses and then treat other people better? Or would it have the opposite effect, that in learning to treat AIs badly, some of those lessons would accidentally carry over to humans? I really worry about the latter possibility, and consequently I try already to be polite to Siri and Alexa and generally treat AIs in the manner that I would like to be treated, precisely because I don't want to inculcate any bad habits of AIs. But I do think it's possible in certain contexts that we could, that it might turn out that interacting with AIs could be a form of catharsis. There's also the possibility, of course, this is something that we could program AIs to display negative reactions like pain when actually they had no trouble with the process. This is a bit reminiscent of the idea in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy of the pig that wants to be eaten. There's also a philosophy book of the same name. But maybe we could build AIs that look like they're suffering, but are actually having a whale of a time. This is also explored a bit in Ted Chiang's short story, The Life Cycle of Virtual Software Objects. Again, though, I would still worry that even if we knew the AIs weren't really suffering, whether that could inculcate bad habits on our part. As to this question of compassion becoming addictive, yeah, well, I mean, I think we already maybe see this with things like Replica. I mentioned already this AI therapist that's being widely advertised and already has something like 10 million users. If you look at things like the discussion forums for this service on Reddit and other places, people are already, I think, seemingly very immersed in using this piece of software and spending probably too much time interacting with it, more than maybe entirely healthy. So I think it could be addictive. And I do worry about the alienation that could come from people interacting with overly sympathetic or overly compassionate AIs to the detriment of their more human social relationships.
Fascinating stuff. Thanks, Henry. So we have now come to the end of our time. So it just remains to thank all of you for coming and for your excellent questions. This has been a great discussion. Also, thanks to the Labour Hume Trust for funding our research, and to the festival organisers and everyone who helped us put this event together. But most of all, thanks, Henry, for a really fascinating talk.
And thank you all for coming, and thanks so much, Ali, for chairing.
Oh, you're very welcome. So thanks very much, and have a happy Easter weekend.
Bye all.